We are going to start off with a question for the audience. We're really just trying to get a good understanding of what the room thinks about what is a brand, right? And so I think we're going to just very simply start at that fundamental question. What is a brand? And so we are looking for answers and engagement.
Yeah. No, you're in the trust tree right here. It's just being archived forever and to be dripped out online forever. So no pressure if you get this wrong, marketers, but go for it. Oh, got one.
It's your reputation and experience.
Okay, that is a correct answer. We will accept that.
It's a shortcut to a promise.
I like that. Very catchy. I might borrow that for the next presentation.
Every experience a customer has with a company.
I like that a lot too. Anybody else? I think I'm most encouraged and pleased that nobody said your logo or your fonts or your colors, because that's typically what most people think. We have another one here.
We always say it's what you make, but also how you make people feel.
That is really important, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that today, is how you make people feel as a key part of that. Wonderful. Anybody else before we? Yep, one more.
Perhaps a different perspective. My name is Bahari Meregi. I'm from Botswana. I am a lecturer at the University of Botswana. So from our perspective, it's your image, whether real or perceived.
That's also very good, correct. And that image can be born from a lot of what we just talked about, your reputation, the experiences that people have, expectations that they have, your ability to deliver on a promise, all of those things.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I mean, so, for us, right, as we really started building off of the content that was presented this morning, right? And one of the key things that we wanted to do is really just kind of set the framework for the discussion today. There's kind of 3 stages here around a brand, right? And first and foremost, it's around building, growing, and evolving the brand, right? And so as you kind of go through this linear relationship for the brand, right? I think part of it is really understanding kind of where you are as a brand and where you want to go, right? And so with that, right, I mean, I think we really just wanted to kind of set the framework for everything.
It's important. I mean, we've all been in meetings with other agency partners, client partners, other marketers, stakeholders who might be receiving our message, and we toss around words a lot, and we think we are talking about the same thing when we say something like a messaging map or a brand strategy, but it's not always the case. So this was a little exercise we just meant to kind of level set us on how we're going to be talking about brand management today and how that's changed really in the last 5 years and how we see it continuing to change, and then obviously where it's headed. And I think that's another topic that our keynote panel is going to be also discussing. So,
and I would just add, because I bring a very communications and PR heavy focus, much different from the marketing and advertising side, and they have to work together. I think a lot of folks know this. There was the question about employer brand and making your employees are your greatest brand ambassadors, and making sure that we're communicating with them in the right way too as well. So just wanted to bring that up. And I also want to say I'm very grateful to be following the trust section, because inconsistency creates distrust, particularly with brand.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So with that end, right, I mean, first key question for the two of you, right? So as the brands kind of evolve, what do you see as some of their most important needs over time?
it starts a lot about what we heard today, and first understanding what your brand's purpose is, why you exist. We heard from Chemical Kim, right? She exists to help make science accessible, and primarily to young people. Her purpose is not to generate followers to sell advertising, right? And so I think it's important to have that North Star first and foremost. And as marketers, while it looks linear behind us, I mean, this thing is, you're going to be dipping in and out of stages based on how your company evolves, based on how your category matures and evolves. So in life sciences marketing, we're often working with companies that have breakthrough new technology where they're essentially creating a category. They're creating a solution to a problem that many people don't even know existed, right? That's when you're doing that, you have to take a different stance about how you communicate about your brand. It's as much about educating and bringing people along to do that than it is differentiating from the other companies who are trying to do the same thing that you were doing. That takes place a little bit more down the line in the maturation process. So you're typically going to spend a lot more time up front on that. So first, it's like knowing what you stand for, what you're trying to do, what problem you're trying to solve, how you're going to shortcut that promise in a consistent way over and over, and understanding that before you do anything else.
I was at Natera for a couple of years, which is more in the prenatal genetic testing space, and they moved into oncology and then organ health. And I think what's interesting to note from there is that the brand needed to evolve with the business strategy, making sure that they still delivered on the promise of giving people information to help them make decisions for their family, but then cancer, organ health, etc. And so I think it's important really in that evolve space to know where your business is at and where the brand needs to best support. Sometimes it's in a proactive way, sometimes it's in a reactive way. As an example, a couple years ago, if you haven't read it, there was a New York Times story about prenatal genetic testing that was quite difficult and challenging for the client, for Natera. And so a lot of it was brand protection. How could we still make sure that people knew our research was valid, that it was peer reviewed, that we were delivering on our promise to get our parents, our families, the information they needed.
Yeah, and that example, we could build off of that one. That's a company that really prided itself in understanding that there was a patient behind every sample on every test tube, and that existed from its very beginning with the prenatal genetic testing and extended then into organ health and oncology. The channels that you use, the audiences to which you speak are going to be different, obviously, as you extend that brand and grow your company, but they stayed true to the way they engaged and the way they launched products. So it was always backed by rigorous data. Their studies often had far more participants than competitive studies, and that allowed them to have that credibility or extend into those other categories. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember Paul brought up the point around humanizing the brand, right? And so, as we think a little bit about humanizing the brand, I'd love to get your take on some of the best examples and, lessons learned as it relates to maybe humanizing some of the brands.
So I was at DaVita for 8 years, headquartered here in Denver. I live here in Denver. And DaVita is actually an excellent example of employer branding and employee branding. Our culture at DaVita is taught at Harvard and at Stanford, where we had a fight song to the tune of "On Wisconsin," and and so everyone had to learn it. But there is something that's really valuable about creating affinity and humanizing every single person at the organization, aligning them with messages. It creates some consistency, and then they can go out in the world and share the same messages about DaVita on Instagram, on TikTok, or wherever they are. That's one way we did it. And of course, we were caregivers, nurses, clinical techs, patient care techs, who would go in and speak with patients, and making sure that they were very human to them, and that one-on-one experience was the way that we humanized it, less so than on social, but in the direct experience and direct care they received.
And there's lots of ways to do that. I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that Paul mentioned it in his talk, because part of AI is making a lot of things easier. But at this point, still, Kantar Media has some research that suggests that AI-generated content for advertising, in particular, is not as trusted or as engaging as something that has a more human element to it. Something that feels more authentic. So when we talk about humanizing it, it could be in the form of your creative, but it's also the way in which the brand, I think, responds to how society is changing. The expectations for all of your companies in terms of you being aware of what's going on in the world and keen on what your clients or your customers care most about has really ratcheted up, particularly since the pandemic. Things like the pandemic, social change, war, the economy can also impact that, political unrest. We as consumers expect the brands that we engage with to be as aware as we are and to reflect our values. A lot of times people see brands as friends, right? They will humanize a company. It's probably more prevalent in, consumer packaged goods. It's easier to see that in things like, Puma sneakers or Budweiser. But you're also seeing that in the life sciences world. I think for a specific example there, Twist Biosciences is a very interesting example, a very human brand, even though they make synthetic DNA. So it couldn't be more fake in that way. But the way in which they engage on social media has a very colloquial, friendly tone to it. Their creative often will feel more like a Nike ad than it will a tired life sciences ad full of stock photos. And so I think that's a good example out there. If you wanted to look at their LinkedIn posts and some of their social media, you'll get a feel for that human nature of it that makes it feel like a friend. Right? So that's important for driving that engagement.
And I would just add, I think that there's some operational discipline we can bring to humanizing things. You don't have to humanize everything. And I think, it's okay to have a bunch of social media canned responses to complaints or how do you de-escalate a situation. But when it matters, you need to know when to humanize. So there were times that our social media manager would respond on social, on Twitter, Instagram, with her initials because it was one of the ones that we knew mattered. It was a parent talking about getting their genetic results or someone saying, for the first time, I know that I'm cancer-free because of their Signatera test. So there were things like that where we knew that we had to humanize. Other times, you don't have to put in the same effort. So knowing where and when is really important.
Yeah, I think empathy is another word that we toss out a lot as people, but also as marketers, and that's another way to, obviously signal that you're human, that you're on the other side of it. So that goes into the communications, whether you're speaking to a bench scientist and you're trying to sell them a consumable or an instrument, or whether you're trying to sell to an oncologist a particular, ctDNA test, or to monitor cancer recurrence. It's understanding what those moments are like, what those people feel when they're making those decisions, what their life is like, and how you fit into that story.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the authenticity is so critical. Now, thinking through some of the channels, right? I mean, you guys had mentioned a little bit of where you interact. How are you seeing some of the engagement change over the last 5 years, right? I mean, clearly there has been a significant move into the social space. Anything else that we should be considering as we think about kind of these elements of the brand?
We've talked a lot about content today. We've talked a lot about LinkedIn. We've talked a lot about your owned properties and where people seek out information. We've talked about how that's being usurped now by Google's AI response so that you don't even get to the website to see the really nice white paper or to see the really nice blog on the particular subject. So it does go back to trying to drive as much human to human interaction as possible. Where we're seeing companies really excel is in venues like this, right? From going back to events, conferences, and face-to-face to have those moments. Certainly the quality of the content that people could find online and the more authentic it feels, especially if it's coming from a person. It was another great comment made earlier today, especially on social. Like, people follow people more than they follow brands. So encourage your team, encourage your clients, if they're agency folks here, to have the superstars at those companies actually be the ones posting and talking and engaging, as opposed to the company itself. That will drive a lot more authenticity, the transparency, and ultimately some of the trust.
Yeah, exactly what Dillon said. I think employees and tapping into how they talk about where they work and what they do, I think is really important. I think generationally, there's a lot more folks who are willing to share what they do on a daily basis, which also feels sometimes inaccessible because maybe you can't tap into them or have a go to coffee. Maybe they don't want that. They definitely don't want to answer the phone anymore, and so I think there's some just understanding where those folks are who are talking about your business, what they're saying, your business, your product, anything. And then the other just note I would make is, about other areas, earned media and third-party credibility still matters. And there's so much out there about like what's fake, what's not, but a high value um, news article still matters to some people. It's still shared on LinkedIn. It's still reposted, retweeted, everything. And so that stuff still does matter. It may not be at the same level, but having those relationships, speaking engagements, awards, that recognition does matter and gives some credibility to the work you're doing.
Yeah. And so to that end, right, I mean, I do want to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, this truly is meant to be engaging, right? So please wave back down and he can, if there's a question that needs to be asked.
I've got a question. Can I ask the audience a question? May I should say? What are some ways that you all are measuring brand engagement today, or measuring what your brand means to the people that you serve? And there's lots of correct answers. So we heard some already. We heard views, downloads, shares, clicks, percent watched. I mean, those are some of these basic metrics. Go ahead, Paul.
I'm going to dodge this and not really answer it, to be honest. I'm going to say how I would love to see it measured versus what really happens in a lot of businesses, which is I'd love to see more unprompted awareness surveys and sentiment surveys to really understand what is the impact of our communications on the people we're targeting versus advertising equivalent value and these slightly meaningless metrics. But the thing is, running those surveys costs money and it's hard. And if you don't plan them and execute them well, then the data can be meaningless. And so I think a lot of companies don't do it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's what I was fishing for. I promise I didn't talk to Paul before this, but that's 100% correct. We'll run brand sentiment studies all the time, aided and unaided awareness. They're actually really easy to set up, honestly, particularly if you partner with a publishing partner like C&EN, assuming that's the right audience. The publishers can be really valuable to you because they have that audience. They vetted it. You can also reach out to them. You don't have to worry as much about the data privacy that we all have to worry about every day in terms of potentially spamming people. And they're pretty easy to set up. And it doesn't have to take more than 5-10 minutes to fill out. And that can give you some valuable research and insights if set up right. We like to do those before an engagement begins, just to kind of take a gut check of where we are with things. And then we can do one at the end, whether that's a product launch campaign or whether you're measuring at the corporate brand level. But it's important to know how to keep score, right? If you're sitting in a room and it's like, oh, we want to, people generally say generate leads, that can sometimes be a lagging indicator of what people think about your brand. Do they want to be your friend? Do they believe what you're selling them? Do they want to tell their friends about you? Right? Those are all the things that I think precedes getting leads. So,
I would add, I think something you said, Paul, earlier about stealing keywords, right, from a competitor. I think that there are some internal metrics to consider that you should ask your teams, like how protected is your brand internally? Do you have a reputational risk plan for your top 5 highest need scenarios? Do you have approvals on it? Do you have reactive statements? Do you own all of your competitive keywords? Do you know what they are? And I think that there's some internal measurement that you can just evaluate and start to put a proactive plan in place to build that going forward.
I did also have a question. I think the pendulum swung a bit, but as brand marketers, I'd love to get your view on how do we convince senior leadership teams to switch investment from performance marketing, lead gen, over to building brand awareness, trust, embedding that promise that we heard about in people's minds because of how much it enables the sales process.
I swear you've seen my slides. No, this is one slide we like to put up in front of the C-suite when they say, well, why would we spend money on understanding what people think about us? Or why do we spend money at kind of the brand awareness level, the storytelling level, of the employer brand level? I think that was a phrase used earlier. And telling people about our culture and telling people what we stand for and how's that going to ship product. Well, you put this slide up, and this is one of these Brand Z studies that Kantar does every year, and they track a portfolio of companies that they've designated to have the strongest brands in the world, and they benchmark those against other famous portfolios like the S&P 500, and there's a clear, and has been now for about 20 years, separation from those brands. And so this is usually gets their attention, at least to entertain the idea, okay, what's that mean for my sector? How do we start to pull that off? It's pretty compelling. Or it's worked for me anyway.
I mean, and some of it is just going back to sharing information that is going to help storytell. At Natera, we had a couple of really key competitors, and we showed them just volume of media coverage, volume of coverage about our research. So we could talk about share of voice, but then quality of coverage. So were our stories more on the positive side, neutral, negative? How did we compare to competitors? So that we could start to say, like, actually, we're quite behind in research, in getting coverage for our research. So that's where we started to be strategically focused in driving media coverage around certain areas where we lagged competitors.
I also think it comes back to the actual journey of that customer, right? And so making sure that you're kind of clearly stating as to where you're investing within those different stages of the journey, I think really makes a big difference in terms of like how you're cultivating the friends and cultivating that crowd versus truly getting to that point of transaction.
You guys both mentioned brand awareness and sentiment studies, and if you can get them done, right? And one of the things that when we have the opportunity to run studies of that nature, we like to ask questions that get at exactly what you asked, right? Not just what are your feelings about this brand? Are you aware of it? How do you feel about it? What characteristics would you assign to it? But also, okay, what does that mean for the company from a sales and lead engagement perspective, right? So how likely are you to purchase from this company? How likely are you to recommend this company to peers? And we also ask that of competitors. So when we run a brand awareness and sentiment survey, we try not to run it just for the company, but to get insight on competitors too. That way you have real, hard, tangible data to go to your exec team with and say, look, our brand sentiment is lower than XYZ. And because of that, our customers are less likely to purchase from us. So we try to bring some tangibility to it. So like you said, it's not just, repeatedly educating the exec team on, hey, this stuff that feels fluffy and mushy is actually really important. So we try to get a little bit clever in the way that we run those brand awareness and sentiment survey.
How many people have a crisis communications plan? Ooh, not
only
once.
Step it up, guys. It's an
just-
election year. You got to get it going.
And honestly, science has been weaponized. Science has been politicized, as we just got done hearing the great presentation before us. And you may think that your clients or your company are not in the crosshairs, and you'd be surprised how quickly you could get pulled in. So it's good to do some planning.
Yeah. So to that end, right? I mean, as you're thinking through some of the big risks out there, right? As we consider what are the things that we should be planning for, right? I mean, the risks today are probably very different from the risk of the future. And so as you're thinking about the future, what kind of risks are your teams planning for?
This is going to sound like a consultant. I'm going to say two different things that sound like they're opposing each other. But one is speed. So if you don't maybe not respond literally externally fast enough to a situation that's developing, but if you don't have those conversations quickly and figure out how to address it, whether it's a reputation, whether it's a dip in market share, whether it's sentiment on social, might be comments about certain things, then you're going to be in big trouble. The expectations are ratcheted up primarily because of the advances in technology. The second thing, though, is not to necessarily rush into having to have a statement or a response to every single thing. And that goes back to knowing your brand's purpose and promise, like Kim said, and understanding what is likely going to happen based on your next action. So I would just say speed and having a sense of your purpose and promise and business strategy codified in a way that you've got a playbook. When stuff happens at the government, they don't just figure it out on the fly, right? There are protocols and documents and binders of things that they're supposed to go through to come to an answer for a reason. So if you don't have those set up, or if your clients don't have them set up, you should definitely have those conversations.
There's in the checklist earlier, honestly, it was some of it too, is what do we stand for? A lot of the current landscape is, are you for something or against something? And that is not always the case. In most companies and agencies and clients, that's not the case. You're not always for or against, but what do you stand for? And I think that's where your brand promise and purpose comes in. So at Natera, we were not for or against various reproductive healthcare laws or regulations. We were for genetic counseling. We were for information sharing, and that helped us define our areas of reputational risk. And so I think it's worth an exercise with your executives to say, like, what are those areas? I mean, always the basics, right? You've got employee issues, harassment, others, but the societal issues that we've seen over the last number of years. Now everybody can plan from COVID. How do you look at remote work? How do you manage lab samples, right? So there are some easy things that we can go back to and learn some lessons and then build a plan from that.
And whatever you end up doing, make sure you do it right and you do it authentically. And it's not just something that ends up at a LinkedIn post or an Instagram post, because that will obviously backfire. I think you guys all get that. You're very sophisticated marketers, but sustainability is a big topic right now, particularly in life sciences, based on the amount of waste that's generated from making synthetic DNA and reagents and all of these things. And companies are, a lot of them are trying to get better about that. They've invested heavily in that, and then rightfully so, they're promoting that. But the last thing you want to be seen as is a company trying to greenwash something, because people can smell that pretty quickly, and that's going to backfire. So
this idea of evolving brands over time and doing that in a way that's authentic. So especially to avoid these things like greenwashing or AI washing is another one. I think there's a lot of products out right now that you feel as if this company is just slapping AI onto something that's existing. So how do you evolve a brand in a same way of like maintaining the core, the truth, the promise of the brand while still moving in a new direction to make it feel current?
it's a very good question. It's hard. And a lot of it you're not in control of. And that, I think, makes marketers scared. What do you mean I'm not in control of what people think about my company? Uber is a pretty good example. Many of you probably Ubered on this trip, right? So when Uber started, obviously it was black cars only. The message was more to guys who wanted to go to the club and look like ballers. That quickly evolved. They had some cultural issues that weren't jiving with people who wanted to take their service. They've addressed that. Now their messaging is much more about gig culture and taking care of people. Their latest campaign, "We're on the way," it tugs at the heartstrings because it's about delivering a lost stuffed animal at a train station. But more importantly, they were able to extend their brand now into a bunch of other services because people had a belief in their ability to get from A to B. So they were smart to say, where else is that important? Like food delivery, medicine delivery, groceries, like you name it. Right. And so that's a brand that showed it evolved internally. I know that they're not perfect, but internally to be a little bit more respectful and in line with their customers' expectations for how a brand should behave. And then externally, in terms of the value that they were able to deliver. There's another good example from Nike, or most recently. I think it was either in an HBR article this month or one from last year around this time, about how they're using AI to design tennis shoes in a way that's so authentic to who Nike is. And it's been a tremendous success. So much like Paula mentioned earlier, they're using it as an additive element to amplify their own human creativity. But it's in line with how they're able to evolve, right, as a brand and still deliver on what people expect from Nike in terms of performance and design and fashion.
And I would go back to putting some processes in place internally, right? Like we did a gut check every 6 months at the last couple of companies I was at, where we would check volume of media coverage, quality of coverage, share of voice, social against a couple of competitors. We also checked our crisis communications plans. We would focus group employees. We had really good partnerships with HR and our people teams. Are they seeing an uptick or a downtick of applications? So are we seeing the same quality of candidates come through the pipeline? I think some of those can be indicators of, successes or opportunities with your brand, just to check. And then, no, I would just say here in Colorado, right? You look at Deion Sanders, his brand is way up here right now. At Florida State years ago, it was not, because he was like that party guy and, got in trouble. And so he has evolved his brand. He has changed his content. He has changed his message. And I think he knew at different points in time when he needed to do that. Maybe it was when he got married, became a father. But I think as the marketers and the experts in the room, when you need a reset or at least a check-in. And I think it's just important to recognize that and put it in place.
I'm glad you mentioned the employees on a couple of occasions, because we've always said, like, the brand on the outside is only as strong as the brand on the inside. So it's really important to take their temperature. We participate in Great Place to Work surveys, which provides really nice directional info that sometimes you don't always get in a one-on-one because it could be uncomfortable. And that's been wonderful because then you can manage to that as well. Your Glassdoor reviews, would definitely look at those if you're not looking at Glassdoor. And again, you can't force people to give you good reviews, but it's a symptom. Obviously, it's something you need to go address and figure out why those aren't scoring high. We've seen more and more companies that will actually research potential partners' Glassdoor reviews because they want to know who they're going to be working with. So
I think it's a great point, and it really speaks to the authenticity of the brand, right? I do. I'm a firm believer that it definitely starts within. So, yep.
Christopher.
Quick question. As somebody whose primary role is as a paid media solutionator, I'm just curious to kind of hear your thoughts about the disconnect that exists between what we get measured on and some of these attributes that you're talking about, quantity and reputation. Those kinds of things are hard to measure, be it clicks and shares.
They are very hard to measure, and they get harder every day because the access to the data has changed, and we don't have as much ability to attribute, I think, a lot of the advertising that we run to actual leads, and people are trying like crazy to do so. I also think there is sometimes an unwillingness on the part of brands to invest that additional, it could be, build one more print ad into your budget potentially and use that to run a survey with C&EN perhaps to better understand people's views on a particular, placement of some sort, right? So I think that there's got to be a willingness and a belief on the brand that it matters. And so I think that's up to us to have those conversations to bring out more data like the Kantar Brand Z or some of the things that we've seen in HBR recently that show how important it is to track those things.
Well, I would just add, and this is where comms usually works a lot with the marketing team, but sponsored content opportunities are great. A podcast where you can better control the message, a bylined article in partnership with, a publication like C&EN. Like there are opportunities where you can deliver a message that may have more authenticity and empathy, like a 30-minute podcast where you can see the questions and deliver it and then splice up that content and reshare it. So it's not a just straight ad buy, but something a little bit different that kind of is that gray area between earned media and paid media.
Someone mentioned the Economist Intelligence Unit earlier. We've done custom research with them on various topics. They're fantastic and obviously a very positive brand that's well trusted. So that tend to go well.
So, I guess my last parting shot for the day would be really if there is one key takeaway for brand management as you think about the next 5 years, what would it be?
I think Dillon referenced it a little bit, is that the speed is quicker now. You used to be able to put a brand, not just the creative, but all of it in place and just let it be for a while. And I think just with the societal pressure, the political pressures, what's happening around the world, you need to keep an eye on it at all times. And just the speed of that, it's daily, weekly, monthly, not once a year like we used to do.
I would agree, and over communicate. We all work in virtual or hybrid environments these days, and you can't take for granted that your team is always going to be on the same page with a world issue, with a company policy update, with a potential customer or a current customer, and how. That's the sign that it's time for lunch. It was much nicer than the green cane. I was about to get yanked off, so.
All right, great.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.